Hello, all. You are listening to the Random Thought Pod. I am your random thought leader, Bridge Livoit, and I am here with author Joshua Lawson. Welcome to the Random Thought Pod, Josh.
Hey, thanks. It's great to be here.
So, you are here to talk about your book, Drugs and Jesus, Faith Meets Harm Reduction.
There we go.
Tell me a bit about yourself. How did you become an advocate for those who suffer from drug addiction?
Yeah, so I have a long history in the faith community, evangelical Christian to be specific. That's almost all of the faith community where I live in Southern Ohio. But in around about 2018, I believe it was, I was given an opportunity to work for an organization called Faith in Public Life, and kind of an advocacy, social justice-oriented group. And they were working on a constitutional amendment, a ballot amendment that year in the state of Ohio. And it was focused in on the intersection of the criminal justice system and people who use drugs and or those who are seeking recovery from a substance use disorder. So I took that opportunity, and it gave me kind of the time and space I needed, because it was a paid gig, to begin to get close to people in my community who were suffering kind of the full weight of the opioid crisis. I live just outside of Portsmouth, Ohio, which is right on the Ohio-Kentucky border, right on the Ohio River, which is nationally regarded as one of, if not the epicenter of the opioid crisis in rural America. We were the location of the first pill mills, it's been close to 2 decades ago now. So I was vaguely aware of the situation. I had friends, people I knew over time who had been affected by drug use and addiction. But that stint working for that organization gave me the space I really needed to get a lot closer to the situation. Begin to listen to people's stories, to really hear where they were coming from, to see the journey that they had taken that had landed them in spots where, a lot of people in society would just be quick to write them off and just say, well, you made a bad choice, now you got to live with it. So, seeing that was impactful for me. And when I came to the end of that season, I'm also a writer, a storyteller. I thought, well, why don't I try to put these two things together? And I began to interview some people that I had met during that season of time to tell their stories. And that became my first book, which was The Face of Addiction. And really from there, it's just been one step followed upon another, just new opportunities as I've gotten closer to the issue, as I've met people who are working in the field, both clinically and those with lived experience, those in the recovery community. And it's just continued to kind of open doors and kind of enlarge my perspective on the issue. And I'm fascinated by the whole thing, and it's the most urgent social need in my neck of the woods. So it just made sense to try to, focus a lot of my work there.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think it's like when it becomes real to you and you're actually talking to people and hearing their stories, makes a great difference. Everything I know about the drug crisis would be from watching Dope Sick, and the other there's like a podcast I was listening to too. I'll actually link that in the show notes, and it kind of details a drug addict's experience in Vancouver, BC. I'm Canadian, by the way. Calgary, Alberta. But and it talks about how like they were replacing methadone with methadose, which is not as good. I'll put that link in there too. So you say that helping drug addicts is right in line with scripture. How does anyone dispute that? Like, it makes sense to help the marginalized. Why would people argue against that?
Great question. And that's what I try to challenge people with who are still kind of on the margins of this problem, kind of keeping their distance from those who are in need. I think there's a lot of ways you could answer that question. It's kind of a case-by-case basis depending on the individual. But there's still quite a bit of stigma surrounding the topic of drug use and addiction. And where I live in Central Appalachia, there's a very strong culture of rugged independence. You live with the consequences of your choices. And so there's still a lingering feeling that drug addiction in this case is just the result of bad choices, and it's a moral failing. And we would be doing a disservice to people if we enable them in their wrong or sinful or destructive behavior. So that's where the disconnect is, especially when it comes to harm reduction, which a lot of folks around here feel is a step or maybe 10 steps too far towards enabling behavior that they regard to be wrong, bad, or sinful. So, and it's real easy when you have a perspective, a paradigm in your mind through which you view people or a certain situation to be blinded to other things. So when Christians come to the scripture, they see those types of things that reinforce, in this case, their more conservative worldview, rather than what might be a more compassionate approach to people who, like you said, they have a story, they have a long history that's brought them to this place. And if you don't know that story, then how can you be moved with compassion to, help them or to stand in solidarity with them? So, that distance from the problem is one big part of it. And I quote the author, John Galsworthy, in my book, who said that our idealism increases in direct proportion to our distance from a problem. And even though it's right here in our backyard, we still have folks who kind of have their heads buried in the sand. They're just kind of waiting for this all to go away, so to speak. And so, it's a lot of things, but the whole purpose of the book was to try to present here a new perspective on this situation from the angle of Scripture for Christians, specifically conservative and evangelical Christians, to see that this is right in line with your faith tradition. This is right in line with the teaching, the example of Jesus. Maybe nobody's ever encouraged you to look at it in this way before, but I'm saying it's there, and it's there in plain sight if you're open to seeing it.
Right. Wow. So you say historically churches speak to communities more than they listen to them. This has been such a point of frustration for me personally. How do you think this has become the case? In America, at least, I think it has somewhat to do with the kind of unholy alliance between church and state that's developed over, a couple centuries here. We've gotten too used to our position of privilege and power in our society. And so, we then associate that with some type of higher moral standing. We think we are blessed or favored by God because we're up here while the rest is down here. And so even if we don't mean to, even if that's not the intention, that can become like this, this lens through which we view and through which we interact with our communities. And, historically, faith communities, especially in a place like mine, we're a county of about 70 to 80,000 people. And there are nearly 200 churches in our county. And they're almost all evangelical Christian Protestant churches. And so where are you going to go? I mean, historically, faith communities and churches are like a second family to most people in areas like ours. That's that you grow up in them. Your pastor, the people that you associate with and interact with at church are like family to you. So even still today, nationally, polls show that faith leaders are one of the most trusted individuals in a person's life and in a community's life. So we've had this position, for better or for worse, where we are the mouthpiece of God, so to speak, or at least we are the storytellers who kind of set the tone for how people in society, more broadly speaking, view and relate to each other. So with that power comes great responsibility, and we don't always wield it well. And one of the ways is we've failed to see that, ultimately the call is to be a servant, not to be served. So, we need to, I think, put down the microphone a little bit more than we do and come down alongside of people and actually listen to the folks in our community. And I think we see this across the country, and it's starting to wash up more on the shores in rural areas like mine. We're becoming a post-Christian society in the West, is what some have called it, and are losing relevance in a lot of cases because we've lost the ear of the people, because we've stopped listening, to those outside of the community, the faith community in this sense. So, it's happened gradually over time, and I think it's becoming more apparent now that we need to put down the mic and actually start listening more than we're speaking. I like that John Heumann quote that you have in the book. I sought to hear the voice of God and climbed to the topmost steeple, but God declared, go down again. I dwell among the people. And so I think that's out.
Yeah.
I like your take on personal responsibility and social responsibilities as it relates to the bootstrap adage, telling people to pull themselves up from their bootstraps. What's your take on that?
Well, my take on that is it's ironic that that's become, a symbol of rugged individualism and self-sufficiency, especially in Appalachian America. And I'm okay with that because, I'm big on that myself. I like to be independent. I like to feel self-sufficient. I like that aspect of personal responsibility. But that adage, originally, if you go back in history, it was created as a way to show that it's really impossible to do most things by yourself, that we don't exist in a vacuum, that we need one another. We need the help of society in general. Think about it. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. That's literally impossible to do. You can't do it, right? So, it's morphed over time to become a symbol of self-sufficiency, which is okay. But originally it was satire. Originally it was going to show that, you who are so hyper-focused on the individual and the individual accomplishments and an individual personal responsibility, you're missing a big piece of the puzzle here, which is our social responsibility that we bear towards one another, to live in community, to be there, to be for one another, to bear one another's burdens, to support and hold each other up. And sometimes, a lot of times, that gets lost in translation in communities like mine. So to be able to balance, the second side of the coin, social responsibility with personal responsibility, is what I tried to do, in the writing of this book.
Okay, so you say that moral judgment is fundamentally different from genuine assessment.
Yeah.
How do the two differ?
So, I understand a moral judgment to be black and white. It's right or wrong. It's yes or no. And we're at a bit of a disadvantage because that's the way our brains are hardwired to see the world. That's helped us to survive evolutionarily. But in most cases, reality is far more gray, especially when it comes to people's choices, especially when it comes to the things they do or do not do in their life. It's not always just a simple matter of, well, this is right, this is wrong, I'm going to choose what is right, especially when you get into the murky waters of drug use and addiction. Understanding addiction, if you do as a learning disorder, as a disease of the brain, however you want to look at it, there's a lot more at play here than just I'm making a choice to do something, even if it's harming me in some sense. So a moral judgment is just that. We look at what a person is doing or not doing, and we say it's right or wrong. Boom. I don't care about the context. I don't care about the story. I don't care about the history. I don't care about where they're coming from perspectively or experientially. Not interested in any of that. But that's what comes out of a relationship. When you get to know somebody, when you begin to learn their story, you understand that there are many steps that have led up to this one. Yeah. And until you can understand that in your life or somebody else's life, you can't really begin to have compassion, whether for yourself or for other people. And that's lacking a lot in our society. We're too disconnected from one another. We're too distant from one another, and therefore we are prone to make judgments. When even the message of Scripture, I think Paul said it most plainly, is you who judge, have you ever stopped to think about the fact that you do the same things? Just in a different way, maybe a more socially acceptable way. If we want to talk about it with addictions, we all have addictions and unhealthy attachments that we suffer with and we suffer due to. But some are more socially acceptable. Some are more okay. And drug use, illicit, hardcore drug use, at least, is one of those it's not. It's still taboo. It's still a no-no. And sometimes that's, for legitimate reasons. But we don't stop to think, okay, who is this person as a human being? Where are they coming from? Why are they doing what they're doing? And how can I relate to that? Because I can relate to that actually very much if I want to be honest with myself.
Okay, so when we blame the addict for being in the mess they are in and write them off as lost causes, you say we are behaving similarly to the people who did not help the man beaten by the robbers in the Good Samaritan parable. This hits hard. Do you think much of this is just lazy thinking? Like we don't want to work to understand?
I think yes, you could definitely look at it that way. Because the work of understanding another person, the work of imagining yourself in their shoes is difficult. And in some ways, it's almost indicting. We like to maintain the distance because we feel more justified in ourselves. And that's why we cast moral aspersions and judgments on other people, because usually we see something in them that corresponds with something in us that we've condemned, or we keep secret, or we hide, or we refuse to face about ourselves. And it's so much easier to project those, dark things that we don't approve of in ourselves onto other people and then easily just judge it there. We see this all the time. This is a theme that Jesus speaks about when he talks about remove the log from your own eye before you speak to the speck in your brother's eye. Paul, as I already referenced, you do the same things that you judge other people for. So it's almost like we refuse to look in the mirror, because that's what we ultimately are for one another. If we're in a close relationship with somebody, there are just so many ways in which that acts as a mirror to our own issues, our own problems, our own shortcomings, our own failures, and we can work those out in relationship to each other. But if we refuse to be in close relationship with each other, if we hold each other at arm's length, then, we can stay at a safe distance where we feel unindictable. We feel we're not a part of this problem. That's their problem to deal with. It's not my problem, right? So that goes back to Cain. Am I my brother's keeper? He wanted to excuse himself from the situation. Obviously, it was more a direct offense there. Cain killed his brother. But we do that in very subtle ways in all of our relationships with those who use drugs, across the board, the marginalized in our community. It's their problem. It's not my problem. I'm up here. They're down here. And so we refuse that relationship because, we do not want to be indicted in the problems that society as a whole is facing. We don't want to see our complicity in systems and in situations and in socioeconomic, factors that are driving a lot of these crises up to and including the opioid and the overdose crisis.
I like the term, those who use drugs. I think that's a good way of phrasing it.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay. So we have this passage I wanted you to read.
Yeah.
Can you read that? I really like this passage.
Yes, I will. All right, so maybe you would never stick a needle in your arm, no matter how bad life got. Wonderful. Good for you. I'm happy to know you were taught effective coping skills that have kept you out of harm's way in this respect. But what about the woman who grew up in the foster care system? She never had a stable family environment to call her own. Even worse, she was molested repeatedly by those who were supposed to take care of her. And nobody ever taught her how to regulate her nervous system when the suffering became unbearable. So now she's living with the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. For all you know, that shot of heroin that she's chasing represents everything she didn't get to enjoy as a distressed child. An imaginative escape from a dark, scary world, or a soft, warm hug from someone who cares about her. Comfort. The very thing that faith communities could and should be providing to people in need.
This really puts it in perspective. It shows the failure of the church. I can really see why you needed to write this book. How do you think the church got so off mission on this?
Yeah, that's a real good way of phrasing it. Mission drift. When you hear that organizationally, but I think that can definitely be applied to the churches. And, that's what I've tried to do with this book is to draw back to that central mission using primarily Jesus's words in Matthew 25, which is whatever you have done or not done to the least of these, you've done to me. Mm-hmm. And that parable, that story he tells of the sheep and the goats really cuts through a lot of theological and doctrinal red tape, a lot of considerations about what about this and what about that. And it's like, okay, if you want to occupy yourself with those things, fine, you can do that, but do it over here. Here's the central mission. Here's what you're to be about. If you can't see the image of God in your neighbor who is suffering, if you lack that kind of faith, then see me there. Have me as an object of faith. He self-identifies with the poor, the marginalized, the outcast, those in prison, those who are sick, all those who are in need, and says, serve me there. So it cuts through that. It draws back in away from that mission drift, why does it happen? 1,001 reasons. We really get our heads in the theological clouds as Christians sometimes. And I tried to show that in the book in the first chapters from my own story, using that John Henry Newman quote. I spent 20 years with my head up in the clouds, so to speak. Always occupied with my vision, my ministry, what I thought was the highest and best and truest will of God, what he wanted from me. And that's all good and that's all fine. But when it's blinding me to the needs of my neighbors down the street who are suffering right now in real living hell on earth conditions, and I'm not moved with any compassion for their plight because I'm so occupied with all these heavenly things, these doctrinal things. That's a real good example to me, and I hope it came forth in the book, of how I think maybe the churches as a whole have and can often do drift from that central mission that Jesus calls us to, which is to be this light in the world, which is to come down alongside of those who are suffering, walk with them, and do what we can to relieve the suffering while we're here.
And I think this is where my struggle lies with the church, is I feel like I used to be part of the worship team. I used to do clinician work with worship teams and teach them how to make their music really, impactful and all this. But I feel like I have such a struggle now with worship music, because I feel like it's all just kind of like, all right, I'm going to get myself right. I'm going to get aligned with God. And people are spending so much time trying to get themselves aligned that they completely miss out on what's actually happening in the world and engaging with it. And it's like similar to what Tony Campolo would talk about, how like there's these people inside a church and there's a guy outside that just got shot and he's bleeding out and dying. And he's like, will someone help me? And the people inside the church are like, yeah, we'll help you in a bit. We're just having a really good experience with God right now. And I just and so for me, it's just kind of like, can we just skip the worship right now and just figure out how we can love other people, because I believe God is pleased with that.
Yeah.
And so as my faith has shifted, I feel like I've become a humanist first and a theologian second, where I'm just kind of like, well, I'm gonna deal with horizontal morality, and the vertical morality is something that I think will come out of that.
Right.
Whereas I think a lot of people within the church are like, I need to get vertical morality completely right so I know what the parameters are of horizontal morality. And so it's like, well, I just got to check to see if God's okay with me helping this drug addict. And it's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great point. And I agree 100%. You mentioned the parable of the Good Samaritan, and that I tried to bring that out from the story in the book, that there was no question here of moral judgment. There's no question here of what led this person to this point. It's just, if in answer to your question, Jesus says to the guy, how do I inherit eternal life? Here it is. Another cut through the red tape moment. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, well, what does that mean? Who's my neighbor? Well, that's the wrong question. Who are you going to be a neighbor to? That's what I'm interested in from you, Jesus says. And he tells this story to illustrate what he means. Who do you think then was a neighbor to the man in need? Was it the one who passed by on the other side? He was busy on his way to church, busy with ministry, administrative duties, had his head up in the clouds, worshiping, whatever you want to, apply to it there. No, it was the man who saw this person in need and stopped what he was doing and did what he could in that moment to help them. That's the man who loved his neighbor as himself and thereby loved God with all of his heart and thereby inherits eternal life. That's like cutting right through the red tape, right? And I think it goes right along with what you're saying. You want to worship, you want to sing, fine, do all that, but not to the exclusion of the central mission, why we're here. And I think the whole incarnation speaks very clearly to this. We get God wrong quite a bit, but that's the central message of the Christian faith, I think, is the Word became flesh. And then we saw clearly, we saw his glory in the form of this person. He joined a working class family. He was born in a stable and humble origins. He wasn't demanding worship. It wasn't this mighty God of glory that was often envisioned by even, Jewish believers in the Old Testament. But it was quite different and quite offensive in many ways. But he says, this is who God is. This is what God looks like. Now follow me,
Wow.
Follow me.
We're having church here in the podcast. I'm loving this. But and I feel like it's like, who is my neighbor? It's like, well, who's in need around you? What's crossing your feed right now? That's your neighbor. We're seeing devastation happening, unfolding in our world news. That's your neighbor. It's like, how can you help them?
Yeah.
Okay, another passage I just can't let go of. In many ways, harm reduction starts with a firm commitment on your part to say no to this blockade of idealism. It means giving up your easy answers and meeting people where they are so you can accompany them on their own healing journey, not as their savior, but as their friend.
Yeah.
Man, the church really needs Jesus to change their hearts on this. And I don't see this at all in the modern church. Well, generally, I don't see it in the modern church. I think like I'm part of a small congregation. I've re-engaged with church,
Yeah.
and it's a small congregation that's kind of working through some issues because we had to leave our denomination because of the stances we're taking. And it's like such a small congregation because the stances we're taking aren't massively popular in evangelicalism.
Right.
So yeah, that's one exception I know of. But it's like, this is how Jesus was a friend of sinners. Like, he actually was able to be their friend. And it seems like people don't have imagination for this. And I feel like I'm just asking the same question over and over again. It's like, how do we get people there, right? But I think like there is story there.
Yeah.
And to me, the most incredible part of your whole book, I'm like just totally skipping ahead in the notes, was that lady who said, "I'm not a drug addict, I'm just a girl."
Yeah. Right.
And she has a story, and like it's so impactful, and it's heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know if this is if that's a lead into a question, but yeah, we miss the forest for the trees, to use that expression. And what that means in a lot of cases is that people, real human beings called by God, loved by God, are lost, are falling through the cracks because we're worried about this or that question of or dispute of doctrine or theological position or what's right and what's wrong and who's in and who's out. That's a big one that I tried to bring forth. And I think maybe chapter 2 of this concept of the theological other, and how if you're paying attention in the Gospels, Jesus is constantly leading his disciples into these apparently random encounters with the other, which would be someone outside of their theological circle, in this case, non-Jewish people. Like the Samaritan, the despised Samaritan who come along. That was an intentional choice in Jesus' storytelling mechanism. The Syrophoenician woman, the Canaanite dog, who came to him crying out. And we reverse engineer that situation to see the process of humanization, to take one who has been relegated to the margins and dehumanized by people who are part of the in-group, and he brings her back until she's a woman standing right in front of him with real needs. And it doesn't matter that she doesn't belong to your group. God is concerned with her. God is active in her life and through her life, in some cases more than he is you guys. He even tells the disciples at one point, "I've not seen this kind of faith in all of Israel."
Wow.
We gloss over that. But what if it was translated today? These true blue fundamentalist evangelical believers who are really convinced that the sphere of God's activity is at least primarily confined within the church, right? Within this in-group that we believe that we are. What if Jesus showed up and said, and he pointed to somebody outside of that circle, far, far outside of that circle, and said, "I have not seen this kind of faith in all of the church." Jesus is constantly leading them to see God active, concerned with, and present with these people who they regard to be on the outside, excluded from the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. It says, look what's happening here. Look what's happening here. And so to have that journey theologically, practically, spiritually, is, to answer your question overall, what I think it takes to move Christians to this place of real, genuine ministry and compassion, is to somehow foster this openness to the Spirit of God, to allow to take us on that journey of seeing God present and active outside of our circles just as much as he is inside. There are shocking things in Scripture, and I tried to pull out a few of those even from the Old Testament prophets, things that the prophets said in the name of God, in the name of Yahweh, that said, God brought these people out of their land, bondage into their land, just like he did, the Israelites from Egypt, to again show, it's not just you, it's all these other people too. And, the call is to see that, to see other people who are currently slipping through the cracks because we got our head in the clouds, because we're doctrinally disputing about this and that. And we've got congregations like yours who are taking stands, trying to walk in solidarity with marginalized people like we believe Jesus did, and that's just a big deal. That's a big thing, right? And all the time people are dying. All the time people are suffering, and that's the main thing, right?
Yeah.
So drawing back the central mission away from that drift, that's the main thing. And so to constantly be bringing that back into people's view, I think that's the essence of what the prophets did. They're constantly calling attention back to the main thing. I despise your feasts. I think it was Amos. Was it Amos that said, "You're flowing, your songs and all that, but let righteousness flow down like a river." That's what I want. So this constant drawing back to the main thing, the main thing, the main thing. All this other stuff is fine until it gets in the way of the main thing, and then it's not fine. And then God's going to call prophets, and they're going to tear it all down.
Well, and I think what it is, and I think when churches, more progressive churches get in trouble is because they're saying, well, you guys are condoning sin so you can have community with these people. And so I would say like this harm reduction is similar to engaging with other like marginalized group where we're just kind of like, well, no. We're breaking bread with these people where they're at, as opposed to telling them you must pass this purity test before you're able to come into our community, right? And it's like let God work with these people, but it's like it's not your job to fix them. It's your job to have community with them and figure out how to keep them alive. Like, I mean, that's what harm reduction is like we're just trying to keep these people alive. And if we can keep them alive, maybe they can get their life on track. Yeah. Whatever that's supposed to look like for them. Exactly.
And again, it all goes back to this fundamental change of perspective. None of that is possible until we stop seeing us and them. Yeah. Right? Like we're somewhere up here and they're somewhere down here, and we're like coming in as saviors to like be what they need. It's not like that. It's all based on this fundamental recognition that we are all essentially the same, that we all essentially share this common human struggle. And it looks different in your life than it does in mine, but it's the same struggle. And I am no better than you, and I am not above you or beneath you. Right? Yeah. We're all on this plane together, so it's this radical solidarity, I think, that forms the basis of the compassion that Jesus calls us to, where we walk alongside of one another rather than, this above or below kind of a hierarchy of valuation that we place upon people. So if we can reframe our perspective to see that we're all in this together, we're all on the same plane. Your suffering, your quirks, your whatever looks a little different from mine, but we can relate. If we get to know each other as human beings, and we enter into a true relationship, we can relate. And then maybe if we can come to that place, we can actually be helpful to one another in a real, genuine, positive way.
Yeah. Well, it's like we're all created in the image of love. Mm-hmm. And it's like, which means that there's parts of love or God that we can learn from each other. Right. And it's like, and when you meet those people who are marginalized, it's like, wow, I am learning so much from you. Right. And it's like, but you have to humble yourself and like not have that mentality, I'm here to help you. Right. It's like, I want to just know you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I read this book called Peace and Good Order by Harold Johnson. And he's an indigenous author who was a lawyer. And he talks a lot about like what's happening in the communities that he's been working with in northern Saskatchewan, where there's like a lot of alcoholism as a result of like generational abuse that's happened, and it started with like our schools, our residential school system, where they tried to force the Indian out of the child, right? Like that was the whole point, is like our government and our church was trying to do that. But he talks about how like there's kind of this perpetual cycle of abuse, and in which like for example, like murder charges that happened, it was like how many of the people who committed these murders were sober? And he's like, in my whole career, only one was sober. Wow. And so it's like you commit all these crimes while under the influence, and then that creates more abuse. And then these people, to escape their PTSD, there's more drug use and alcohol use that perpetuates itself. And he argues against like a deterrence-based justice system and talks more so about helping people have the opportunity to make amends And so I think when you talk about like children who are abused or neglected, and how we do nothing about it, and then when they grow up, they become these broken adults. And it's similar to what he was saying in the book, where it's like we then punish them for how they acted out. So how do you think we can intervene, early in these situations where someone's being abused?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have to stop. I think one example is we have to stop separating people according to these perceived categories. So, that's a great point you make. And I think it is in line with the person you're talking about. I know here where I live, we have also a foster care crisis that's closely related to the opioid and the drug use and all the stuff going on here. We have more children in foster care in our county per capita than any of the metro areas across the state of Ohio. And a lot of it is because children are pulled out of their homes when the parents or the caregivers are found to be, using some capacity. And everybody's so sympathetic to these kids, understandably so, rightly so, right? And so moved and so wanting to help and wanting to change the situation. But yes, 20 years from now, statistically, when some of these or many of these kids end up, because of their trauma, because of their brokenness, because of the pain, they end up like maybe their parents are in a similar situation. Then the compassion goes away. Then the sympathy goes away. Then the caring goes away. How do we get beyond that? We do have to focus on the kids, but we have to understand that the kids are a part of a family structure. I hear that a lot from folks around here. We need to quit putting so much time and money and attention into drug treatment for the adults. We just need to cut them loose and let them go. There's no hope for them. We got to focus on the kids. Okay, but these kids are going home to parents and families where there's this environment. So you can't just separate the kids out from that environment and say, we're going to help them and not them. Right? I hear that. Another example I hear all the time is, we need to focus less on the druggies and we need to help our veterans, and I'm like, there's a lot of veterans on the street, unhoused. There's a lot of veterans with mental health and addiction issues. To help one is to help the other. But we segment people out. We create these categories and we say, these are worthy of our help. These are deserving of our help and these are not. Based on some level of perceived innocence or whatever it might be. So we have to stop doing that. And we have to find ways in our communities of doing that, from a systems level, programmatically, we have programs that are for kids, programs that are for people in reentry. We have to, I don't know. It's a really great question. And it's not getting explored as much as it should be in our communities, but we have to stop seeing people as separate categories and kind of address them as they are in the situations they are. And that's why I like harm reduction, this whole mantra of meeting people where they are. And okay, let's go from there. We're not coming into the situation with an ideal picture in our head of how things should be. We don't know. We just know how things are today. So let's start there and let's take the next step together. See what a person needs, listen to them from their perspective, not just what I assume that they need in the situation, because I don't know. I don't know. I don't know where they're coming from, and I don't know what's going to be best for them. But if I begin to listen to them, form a relationship with them, they can tell me, or they can tell whoever. So great question. I think that's a bit of a muddled answer, but it's a really good question.
It's all going to be muddled answers. I mean, there's just no easy answers for these. I think what's really interesting is like when the topic of veterans comes up, because there's just all of a sudden it's like, no. We would not be able to talk to each other today if it weren't for the veterans. Sure. And like for me, maybe I spent a little bit of time in a Mennonite church, so maybe I'm too pacifist now. But I'm just kind of looking at them like, I don't understand why we send soldiers over to Afghanistan to like inadvertently like kill children. And then we're looking at it and we're saying, well, because of that, we're able to talk today, right? We have freedom of speech because of it. And I'm like, I don't connect. And what's so interesting to me too is like within like the church, it's like we conflate being willing to die and being willing to kill. Sure. So it's like, so we kind of look at it, it's like, well, it's like greater love has no man than to lay down his life. Mm-hmm. But we actually, what we really mean is greater love has no man than to be willing to kill for those who he loves.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's like freedom comes at a price, and we always think about the, say the veterans that die, but it's like the veterans that come back. It's like, well, hopefully you killed someone for us, right? And so, it's such a difficult issue, and I don't want to disrespect people who do put their lives on the line.
Sure.
But I really question, like, what are we doing? Like, what is the point of all this war?
Yeah.
And I know this is totally a separate topic, but it's just like to me, it's just too bad that, like, when we have the drug addict on the street, it's like, well, were they a war hero? If they were a war hero, then we care. Right. If they're not a war hero, they're useless.
Right.
Right. And it's like, but it's like that whole, like, I can't even do the math for why the war hero is better. Mm-hmm. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. Like, it's just kind of this thing that's ingrained in our culture that it's like our veterans need to be treated well.
Yeah.
And it is a shame that people who, it's like these people have injuries that are directly the result for working for your government.
Right.
And so, I mean, like, just from that perspective, I'm like, yeah, that's really messed up. But it's like, I just would love for us to not categorize people like that.
Yeah. So many of the issues, the social crises, they're all so interrelated, and that's where it can get really complex, and that's where it can really get overwhelming. And that's why some people, like, I'll talk with my wife about a lot of things, and we'll laugh about it because, like, it motivates me to, like, see what's going on in the world. And then, like, say, okay, how can I fit into this? How can I be a part of some type of solution? It overwhelms her. She's like, don't talk to me about all this stuff. I don't want to hear the latest of, Israel and Gaza and all this stuff, as an example, because it's more paralyzing for her. So I think people have different responses. But yes, it is true, though, to see all of these things are interconnected. They are related in so many ways. It's this big, messy entanglement. So to really get at sustainable solutions that go to the root instead of just, hacking away at the branches, the symptoms of the problem, that's a whole nother ballgame. And I think the veterans and war and all those relationships really kind of bring that out for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's just like we want power. We want power on our side. And it's I think that's kind of the oomph with all of this. I mean, it's like that's where we're going wrong with politics too. We're like, we want a powerful person to speak on behalf of us. And I'm like, this is so anti-Jesus. Like,
yeah.
And so, all right. So you say, another quote from your book. Let's say it one more time for good measure. It is not what goes into a person that defiles them, but what comes out of their heart as evidenced by the words they speak. So, it's not so much the man on the street with the unsterilized needle in his arm who is defiling himself, but the person in the pew at the church down the road whose words about that man, whether spoken in public or in private, betray the stigma they carry in their heart toward him. Speaking about another person as though they were something other than or less than the beloved child of God that they are, doing violence to the image of God, with stigmatizing, dehumanizing language, that defiles a person far more than shooting up with a dirty needle. Wow. Those are good words. I'm like, this is just something that's so incredible to me, as I've kind of stepped away from evangelicalism, is just like being able to see how little self-reflection people tend to have. And I'm like, I would hope that Christians would be the most self-reflective people out there.
Right.
It's like, if you believe you're a sinner saved by grace, then you should be able to be like David and say, is there anything offensive about me? But I think maybe that offensive part is that they're fixated again on the vertical morality, where they're like, is God offended by me? But they're not thinking about, like, am I offending the image of God in this person?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one good way of illustrating that is kind of this popular view of, like, the Pharisees. I think the Pharisees overall get a bad rap historically. What I've read, they weren't all bad guys, but definitely in the Gospels they're portrayed as, hey, don't be like these folks. Right. As opposed to Jesus, right? And I think one of the ways that the writers of the Gospels bring that out is just what you said, that over concern for the vertical, right? Jesus said, you'll swallow a camel and strain at a gnat, or was it the other way around? You'll tithe, down to the 10% on mint and, these little herbs and spices, but you ignore the weightier matters of the law, he said. Justice, righteousness, right relationship with your neighbor. And how did that come out? Well, they were afraid to touch the leper, right? For fear that the leper would contaminate them.
Yeah.
Right? That they would catch what they had. Okay, and I think that's symbolic there. That's a good metaphor. Jesus comes along, and what does he do? He lays hands on. He touches the leper, right? Not afraid of them contaminating him, but he's just overflowing with this love, this generosity, this faith that's going to actually affect them. It's going to go the opposite way. And so I think that speaks to two totally different postures on life and how we regard one another. And a lot of it comes down to, I think, again, that, yes, what you said, the perspective of, am I so concerned with me and God and this right relationship that I think comes down to this and this and this, and it causes me to be blind to the needs of those around me and to keep them at arm's length? Or am I going to approach it the way of Jesus, which is, yes, he cared about his relationship with the Father. He was all the time going off to pray, to spend time in solitude alone and all that kind of stuff. But when he saw the people, he was moved with compassion. He came down from that place constantly to be with the people, to walk with them. That's why they loved him so much, because they sensed that this guy is with us. This guy is one of us. This guy is not coming at us from the same position, vaulted, up in the ivory tower of the temple or whatever, what have you. He's willing to sit with us, to listen to us, to lay hands on us, to actually touch us. And he's not afraid that we're going to bring him down, and that had a way of doing the opposite effect, that being in his presence elevated these other people to be their best self, to repent or to, do good for among their community and their families, whatever it might be. So yeah, it's indicting, yes, but again, I think it was C.S. Lewis. He said something once that comes back to me sometimes. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it is thinking of yourself less. And I think there is this kind of narcissistic strain that runs through a lot of the churches where we're so concerned with me and God, this personal relationship, to the exclusion of so many of these very vital social concerns and relationship with the neighbor, the horizontal relationship, that ultimately, if you read the prophets, if you look through the Old Testament, the wisdom traditions, if you look at the message of Jesus throughout the New Testament, that's really where the meat is. That's where the relationship with God is. I think it was Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, who said, we only really love God as much as we love the person we hate the most.
Right.
Like that's the bar, that's the measurement. It's not what you do in the secret place, between you and God in your heart. It's how you relate to that person whom you regard to be the other, whom you regard to be the enemy, whom you regard to be outside or sick or in sin or whatever. That's the measure of your relationship with God. No matter what kind of mystical, spiritual, vertical connection you think you've got, you're cultivating, that's where the rubber meets the road, is in the horizontal. So yeah, man, I'm totally with you there.
I love that vertical and horizontal, and I stole that from a creator. I'll link that person. Yeah. She's like I think she's an atheist now, former Christian, but when she talks about like Christianity and where Christianity goes wrong, she basically says there's just this fixation in the vertical. And once I saw that, I'm like, I can't unsee it. I mean, this is the very problem. Yeah. And so, okay. So I love this like Martin Luther King quote. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day, we must come to see the whole Jericho Road must be transformed, so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Like, we need to capture this vision. It's interesting to me just how many people celebrate Martin Luther King Day, but would not consider the values behind such a quote.
Yeah.
It's so, I mean, like, people, it's like paying lip service to Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it seems to be like kind of within the American mores now that that's what you do.
Oh, yeah.
Yet these people aren't really willing to think about the things that he actually said. It's
Yeah,
a lot like Jesus. Like
it
it's
is.
like not that Martin Luther King was Jesus, but man,
Sure.
he was onto a lot of things that people are
Hmm.
just like, okay, we're gonna make him our mascot, but we don't really want to use his words too much. And I think
Sure.
that's kind of what's happening with Jesus too.
Yeah, it's nothing new, right? I mean, and
Yeah.
Jesus himself said to that one group of religious leaders that you kill the prophets and then you adorn their tombs. You
Ooh,
assassinate Martin Luther, you turn a blind eye, a deaf ear to his message, and then you make him a federal holiday.
that's so crazy.
It is, right?
Yeah. Huh.
I think it's, I think Martin Luther King Jr. is a good example of a figure that's been whitewashed in American society, to
Mm,
where we lift up and we celebrate the values that align with our traditional mythos. But the ones that
yeah.
challenged, the more prophetic stuff, we pretend it's not even there. The fact that
Yeah.
the week before he was shot, he was joining striking sanitation workers, and he was
Mm,
beginning to call attention not just to the more overtly racist elements in society, but how they factored in with like issues of class,
mm,
you know, and uniting people of color, both white and black, in this struggle for those who were oppressed, those who were suffering, those who were at the bottom of the ladder, so I think that's what this quote too is getting at. That eventually, acts of goodwill, acts of charity. Charity is not enough. Charity can actually be a symptom of the problem.
yeah.
It's solidarity is what we need. That's the way of Jesus. It's not charity. The fact that we live in a system that produces such a great need for acts of charity because we've got all these beggars laying around wounded everywhere. That's an indictment on the system that we have built and that we allow to continue every single day. And so I think in the evangelical mindset, that's why it's real easy to just focus on personal responsibility, personal sin as acts of, violation between the individual and God, and just really not care about the systemic issues, the systemic sins, because then it indicts us all equally. We're allowing this to go on every single day. And I'm
Yeah.
as much responsible for that. Maybe I didn't cause it. Maybe I didn't start it. It's not like that. It's not like I'm weighed with this personal guilt every day because, we haven't dismantled the criminal justice system yet. But it does help me to see my complicity in that system, which is harming a lot of my neighbors. And so Martin Luther King was starting to really bring that out before they killed him, which I think is also why we have a Martin Luther King Day and we don't have a Malcolm X Day, because when you read the writings of Malcolm X, man, he was far more explicit in his critique of American society. And so, yeah, we do that. We kill the prophets and then we adorn their tombs. We did it with the Old Testament guys. We did it with Jesus. We do it with Martin Luther King Jr. Because if we're going to focus too much on the systemic side of things, then we're all guilty and we're all
Right.
complicit. And then we're all responsible to do something with that knowledge.
Hmm.
And really, we don't want to.
No, we
Especially
don't
those
want
of
to
us that
know.
have, comfort and privilege. We don't want to do anything. Don't wake
Yeah.
me up. I'm good. I'm good right here.
Okay, so don't wake me up. I like that. Reminds me of the term they always use against people who are social justice oriented. I
Right.
won't say it.
Yeah.
Okay. So tell me about the conditions that cause addiction problems. Like, I know we've addressed some of it. Is there anything we're missing in what causes addiction issues?
Well, the classic definition of addiction is something that you're so attached to that you continue to engage in it, even though it brings you harm. That's kind of the classic definition of an addictive behavior, compulsive behavior. And that
Right.
applies to drugs. It also applies to other things, food, gambling, sex. It's been applied to all kinds of things. The DSM-5 now even has a designation for like video game addiction and social media and stuff like that. So it's all about this trap we fall into where we're relying on something to get temporary relief for a problem. I mean, it's doing something for us, something good, something that we need. It's meeting a need temporarily. We got to keep coming back to it. And then, but that as we do that long term, it's doing more harm for us than it is actually good and meeting that need. So it's an unhealthy adaptation to life. It's an unhealthy coping mechanism. It's a learned behavior that is ultimately destructive, I think is how we can look at addiction. And yeah, for most people, that arises out of, a foundation of a whole lot of unresolved trauma, nervous
Right.
system dysregulation, pain that has not yet been met and transformed in their life. And that's what's driving it. Socioeconomic factors that predispose a person to these types of unhealthy responses to life's stress. there's a whole lot underneath it for a whole lot of people. And that's why I enjoy the work of people like Gabor Mate. I know he's a physician up in Canada, up in your neck of the woods. I've gotten a lot out of his work over the years and how he connects trauma with addiction and showing, the underpinnings of what it's like for most people, and that it's entirely human and it's entirely understandable, and we all have it in our life, even if in some of us it's more socially acceptable, it's more hidden under behaviors that appear more healthy and normal. So yeah, I mean, really, the overdose crisis currently is an indictment on the criminal justice response to drug use and addiction. And the mental health and addiction crisis, all the diseases and deaths of despair that are rising across the Western world in such alarming rates, is an indictment ultimately on the society itself that we've built. That we have what is, on one hand, it's allegedly the most prosperous, rich, wealthy, powerful country, nation, society in the history of the world. And yet at the same time, we have an increasing number of people, young to old, black, white, across all demographics, who cannot bear to be present in their lives in the midst of this social context. So ultimately, that's the indictment, I think, that underlies the overdose crisis.
Yeah. Something I keep hearing again and again, like there's this Irish rapper, Ren, who in one of his songs, he says, those of us who are mentally ill, it's the result of our society being so messed up. And it's like, perhaps, it's the people who are mentally not ill, those people who are mentally healthy, maybe they're the true sick ones.
Right.
And it's so interesting because I see that coming up and up again, too. There's like a TikTok creator that I see that keeps saying that, too. And I'm like, this seems to be like a thought that's kind of being perpetuated right now, which I'm like, that's so interesting. And like, it's, like where our therapy system is really trying to get people to cope with, well, it's like the Good Samaritan situation, right? Where it's like, well, this is how you cope with the fact that robbers are going to beat you up and take your money, right?
Yeah.
When we're not actually addressing what's causing all these illnesses. And I think that like the church could have such a good role to play in this, in righting some of these wrongs and like making our society better. Where we're actually, instead of ignoring these things and like, just trying to get ourselves right with God, we're actually trying to figure out how to make our society a place where people are able to not have to hide things. Like, I think that's the thing, is like, we're trying to get people to hide things all the time, when in reality, it's like, let's let people have their own journey and walk alongside with them on their journey instead of placing all our expectations on them. Okay, so a couple more things. You say harm reduction began in Genesis 3. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So that was just a fun little take there at the end of the book. I wanted to include some history of the harm reduction movement as a whole. And I didn't get anywhere near close to encapsulating that. That's why I point readers to other works. Maya Salovitz, in particular, who has done that recently in her latest book. But I wanted to also throw in that theological tie-in, as I tried to do throughout my entire book. And so, as I sat down to write that chapter, and I thought, well, how can I really like introduce this? That's just where my mind went. And to consider the story of the creation and the fall of humanity as we consider it, typically from this angle, through this lens of seeing harm reduction and faith as an overlapping concern here. Well, when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, we know the story, then God said, well, you got to go, and he exiles them from the garden. And as good evangelical Christians, we're very prone to seeing that in like a penal, point of view. Right. Moral judgment, right and wrong, and then you choose wrong, you get punished. That's how we understand almost everything. And looking at it differently, though, because God says, oh, now they've eaten the tree of life. So let's remove them from the situation so that or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Let's remove them from the situation so they don't now take and eat of the tree of life and live forever in this fallen state, essentially. So when you look at it that way, it's an act of grace. Not punishment, not judgment. It's God saying, oh, here's the situation. What are we going to do with this? Well, I want to reduce the harm associated with the choice they've just made. So I'm going to remove them from the garden. I'm going to send them out. Maybe it looks like a punishment. Maybe it looks like a judgment. But my concern here is that they don't remain this way forever. So I got to do some stuff now to try to fix this, to try to help them find their way out or back to the garden, right? Because if I just leave them here where they're at, it's going to get worse. So when you're just viewing it through that lens, that angle, we see God's act of expelling Adam and Eve from the garden as an act of grace, as a move towards harm reduction. So to frame it in that way and really see, again, just to show throughout Scripture, there's all kinds of theological basis for faith-based harm reduction. And we're not enabling anything bad or wrong. We're just meeting people where they are, and we're doing what we can to say, hey, I support you. I love you. I want the best for you. So here's what I'm going to do to just try to support that vision for your life. So it has that basis all throughout Scripture.
Okay. Part of me kind of hesitates to bring this up, but Christine, I kind of mentioned her briefly. I didn't mention her by name, but I just wanted to kind of give you an opportunity to kind of just tell her story a little bit. Maybe what is the image of God you learned from her? And then, it's so tragic and it's so sad. And I'm I'm assuming this is hard to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it's meaningful. I can talk about her. It's fine. But it's meaningful because of all the people I've met early on, because I featured Christine in my first book. That's how I met her. She heard from a friend or something, or saw online that I had this project going on where I was interviewing people for my first book to tell their stories and humanize them and their struggle. She reached out to me, wants to meet up, wants to tell her story, wants to, talk. We can't make it work at first. She continues to pursue the opportunity until finally we do. We sit down. I listen to her story. And of all the people I've sat down with, I can't remember every moment, how I felt, how it impacted me. But I remember the look in her eyes when she said those words, that I'm just a girl. I'm not an addict. I'm not some monster. I didn't ask to go through the things I've went through in my life. Who would? And again, that relates to all the things we've already talked about in general, the things that underlaid her experience of drug use and addiction. To see the urgency in her eyes, to see, the tears welling up behind, these words that she's speaking to me like this, because that was at the end of our interview. And she turned it back around on me. I'm interviewing her. I'm asking her questions about her life. And I remember afterwards, she said, what do you think? What's it going to take to get people to see that people like me, we're not monsters, that we didn't ask for any of this, that we're good people. We're trying our best. We love our family and our friends, and we're doing what we can to rebuild. That's how it happened for her. It was a long period, lots of hardships she went through in life. She was trying to write it out herself. After I interviewed her, she contacted me to help her write her own book of her own life story. And man, it was brutal. I've still got the document she sent me. It was just brutal, some of the experiences that she went through in life. I mean, you talk about abuse, neglect. We hear those terms. It's very broad, very general, very vague. But man, when you hear the stories from a person like Christine, it was just, oh God, heart-wrenching. And she eventually she had a substance use disorder. She had overdosed many times. The last time she lived in Columbus, which is about 2 hours north of me, Columbus, Ohio. She woke up to the sound of her son's voice shouting her name. She was laying in the bathtub. He thought she was dead. She woke up. She agreed to look to, get into treatment somewhere. And that's how she ended up coming down to the area of the county just adjacent to where I live. She got into a faith-based treatment center. And in her own words, they loved her. They believed in her until she was able to believe in herself. And I remember she told me a few stories of moments when talking with some of the workers there and just sharing her story with them. And they were able to look her in the eye and without judgment and say, look, I understand. I know where you're coming from, but God loves you. We love you, and we're here for you until you can learn how to love yourself, and how transformative that was for her. So she got back on her feet, and she was just contagious with this passion to like reduce the stigma surrounding people who use drugs and those who were in recovery. And she was doing all this stuff. She wanted to start a woman's home. She had no experience, no technical expertise, no nothing. You know, she moved into my county. I tried to connect her with folks who were doing the work here to help her form connections and all that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, around the holidays, however many years ago it's been now, I think it was 2019. Lost touch briefly. The last I talked to her, she was, gathering gifts for kids and for some families that she knew around the holidays. Christmas came and went, New Year's came and went, and then I had another friend who I also feature in this book, and she contacted me one day and said that she saw an obituary and learned the news that Christine had passed away. Didn't know what happened, suspected, that maybe she'd relapsed and overdosed. I was able to track down her daughter online via Facebook, and, she confirmed, yes, Christine had relapsed, and she felt too ashamed to tell anybody. After everything she'd gone through, after all of her own passion to end the stigma, to come into the light, to speak out, to always reach out for help, telling other people this in her moment of deepest need. Even having formed those connections, even having been in recovery for a number of years now, when she fell back into that, she was too ashamed to come and ask for help. And so, I can only imagine that the last time she used, she was alone. She was there alone. And that's how it ended for her, unfortunately. So, it was kind of a no-brainer for me, of all the people I've met, to dedicate this book to her with the passion that she had to speak to people in a way that really helped them to see, hey, I'm just a girl. I've gone through a lot of stuff, and it's brought me to some hard places. There's a lot of darkness. Yeah, there's bad choices, but this is what's behind it all for me and for a lot of other people. And if you can just understand this, then maybe you can relate to me, and then maybe we can form a relationship, and maybe we can help each other. Maybe we can find our way out of this together. And I think that's ultimately the calling of the church. I think that's the value, that's the potential value that faith communities hold. Like you said, we could really be speaking to this issue and this problem in so many more life-giving ways than we currently are. But I think it starts there. We've got to get to know people. We've got to hear their stories, and we've got to see them as human beings. Just like Jesus in that encounter with the Canaanite woman, not a dog, but a woman, made in God's image. So I dedicate it to Christine for that. And I do appreciate you asking about her specifically.
Wow. Thank you. What a way to close this. I really appreciate your work, and I appreciate all I've learned from you. How do we put our listeners in contact with your work?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's lawsonwrites.com, Lawson, Writes, WRITES, all lowercase. They can order signed copies of my books there. They can join my newsletter there, get updates on future work. I'm also on social media. Facebook is where I'm most active. Facebook, Instagram. I do a little Tik Tok. It's not all related to this kind of work because I have an interest across many fields. But joining the newsletter through the website is the best way to stay up to date on similar work and future things coming out.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was an honor to be here. I appreciate the conversation.